The note was small, so light it should have meant nothing. But the moment it touched his palm, everything inside Aurelian Cross shattered, because written in hurried ink were 7 words that didn't belong in a place like this. Your girlfriend sold you out. They're in position. Across the table, the woman he loved smiled at her phone, completely relaxed. Sunlight spilled through towering windows, turning crystal glasses into prisms of gold. This was a restaurant where danger did not exist, or so he believed. Aurelian had survived boardroom wars, hostile takeovers, and enemies who would gladly see him ruined. But he had never prepared for this. Not betrayal served with linen napkins. Not death planned in broad daylight. Not the quiet courage of a stranger who chose to speak when silence was safer. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was the woman sitting across from him, really? Why would someone choose a public place for something so final? And why did a waitress, a woman with nothing to gain, risk everything to warn him? What happened next was not an accident. It was a chain of choices, small human choices that exposed a truth far bigger than money or power. And by the end of this story, one question will linger. When the moment comes, would you speak up? Aurelian Cross wasn't born into wealth. He grew up in a small apartment in Newark, New Jersey, where the walls were thin enough to hear arguments 3 doors down, and the refrigerator hummed louder than it cooled. His mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning office buildings at night and serving breakfast at a diner during the day. His father left when Aurelian was 7, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and a half-empty closet. Aurelian learned early that hunger teaches discipline faster than comfort ever could. He learned that trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. So he worked. He studied under dim lamps while his mother slept on the couch, too tired to make it to her bedroom. He graduated top of his class, earned a scholarship, and clawed his way through business school with a focus that bordered on obsession. By the time he was 30, he had launched his first tech startup. By 40, he had sold it for enough money to never worry again. By 50, his name moved markets. Executives stiffened when he entered a room. Journalists called him a visionary. But behind closed doors, there was a quiet exhaustion he never spoke about. The kind that comes from building walls so high you forget what it's like to let someone in. Then came Selene. They met at a charity gala in Manhattan. One of those events where people donated money to feel less guilty about having so much of it. Aurelian had been standing near the bar, nursing a glass of whiskey he didn't really want, when she approached him. She didn't introduce herself with a business card or a rehearsed pitch. She simply asked if he believed in second chances. The question caught him off guard. Most people wanted something from him, an investment, a partnership, a photograph. But Selene seemed genuinely curious. She had soft brown eyes that held his gaze without flinching, and a voice that didn't try to impress. She told him she worked in art restoration, that she spent her days bringing old paintings back to life. There was something poetic about that. Something that made Aurelian feel like maybe he could be restored too. They started seeing each other. Slowly at first, dinner once a week, then twice. Then she was staying at his penthouse on weekends, filling the space with laughter and music, and a warmth he hadn't realized he was missing. Selene didn't chase his money. She never asked about his portfolio or his next acquisition. She talked about travel, about the museums in Florence she wanted to visit, about the small bookstore she dreamed of opening one day. She made him believe that maybe, finally, he could rest, that maybe he didn't have to be Aurelian Cross, the empire builder, all the time. That maybe he could just be a man who loved a woman who loved him back. Mara Vale had no empire. She had calluses on her feet from 10-hour shifts and a studio apartment in Queens that smelled faintly of the Chinese restaurant downstairs. She was 31 years old and had been working in restaurants since she was 16. She knew how to read a table before the first order came in. She could tell who wanted conversation and who wanted to be left alone. She memorized names, preferences, the way people liked their coffee. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and Mara took pride in doing it well. She had grown up in a household where silence was survival. Her father had been a truck driver, a quiet man who kept his head down and his opinions to himself. But when Mara was 12, he witnessed something he shouldn't have: a warehouse manager taking bribes, skimming inventory, selling goods off the books. Her father didn't report it. He convinced himself it wasn't his business, that speaking up would only bring trouble. 2 months later, the manager's scheme collapsed. The company went under. Hundreds of people lost their jobs, including her father. Mara watched him shrink after that. watched guilt eat away at him until he became a shadow of the man he used to be. He died of a heart attack when she was 19, and Mara always wondered if the weight of that silence had something to do with it. She learned then that staying quiet doesn't protect you, it just makes you complicit. So when Mara noticed the men by the exits that afternoon, something inside her went cold. She had been working at Lumiere, an upscale French restaurant in Midtown, for 3 years. She knew the regulars, the rhythm of the room, the way people moved through space. And these men didn't fit. They sat too still. Their eyes swept the room too often. One of them kept glancing at his watch, not like someone waiting for food, but like someone waiting for a signal. Mara had seen Aurelian Cross before. He came in once a month, always with the same woman, always ordering the same wine. They seemed happy. He laughed more with her than he did with the business associates he sometimes brought in. But today, something felt different. Celine kept checking her phone, her fingers tapping against the screen with a nervous energy Mara hadn't seen before. And then there was the nod. It was so quick, Mara almost missed it. Celine glanced toward the mirrored column near the restrooms and gave the slightest tilt of her head. One of the men responded with a barely perceptible shift in his posture. Mara's stomach dropped. She didn't know what was happening, but every instinct told her it was wrong. She grabbed a pen from her apron and tore a corner off her order pad. Her hands shook as she wrote, "Your girlfriend sold you out. They're in position." She didn't sign it. She didn't explain. She just folded the note and placed it under the rim of Aurelian's plate as she set down his entree. He didn't look at her. He was looking at Celine, smiling at something she had just said. Mara walked away, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack through her ribs. She had no idea if he would even read it. No idea if she had just saved a life or made a terrible mistake. All she knew was that her father had stayed silent once, and it had destroyed him. She refused to carry that same weight. Aurelian didn't notice the note at first. He was laughing, genuinely laughing, at a story Celine was telling about a disastrous blind date she had been on years before they met. But then his hand brushed the edge of his plate, and he felt the paper. He glanced down. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, the kind of writing that comes from adrenaline. Your girlfriend sold you out. They're in position. His smile didn't falter. He had learned long ago how to control his face, how to keep his thoughts hidden behind a mask of calm. But inside, every alarm was screaming. He looked up at Celine. She was still smiling, still scrolling through her phone. But now he noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked toward the exits just a fraction too often. He studied the room without moving his head. 2 men near the bar, dressed too formally for a casual lunch. Another by the side exit, pretending to read a menu he had been holding for 15 minutes. And 1 more near the restrooms, watching Aurelian with the kind of focus that didn't belong in a place like this. Aurelian's mind moved fast. If Celine had orchestrated this, she wouldn't have done it herself. She was too smart for that, which meant these men were hired, which meant someone else was funding this, which meant this wasn't personal, it was business. And if it was business, there was a window, a moment before violence, where negotiation was still possible, or escape. He reached for his wine glass and took a slow sip, buying himself time to think. Celine looked up from her phone and smiled at him. You okay? You seem distracted. Her voice was soft, concerned, the same voice that had whispered goodnight to him 100 times. And that's when he saw it, a flicker of something in her eyes. Not love, not regret, calculation. She was waiting for something, watching him, measuring his reaction. And Aurelian realized with absolute certainty that the woman he loved, the woman he had trusted with parts of himself he had never shown anyone, had been planning this. Maybe for weeks, maybe from the very beginning. He set down his glass and smiled back at her. I'm fine. Just thinking about the merger. You know how it is. She nodded, seemingly satisfied, and returned to her phone. But Aurelian was already moving. Not physically, not yet. But mentally, he was 3 steps ahead. He couldn't run. That would trigger them. He couldn't confront Celine. That would accelerate whatever timeline they were operating on. He needed to create chaos. Something unexpected. Something that would force them to hesitate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He typed a message to his head of security, a former Secret Service agent named Marcus, who had been with him for 6 years. Lumiere, Midtown, threat imminent. Call NYPD, silent approach. He sent it. Then he stood up. Slowly, casually, like a man excusing himself to use the restroom. Celine's eyes snapped to him. Where are you going? Her voice was just a little too sharp, a little too fast. Restroom, he said easily. I'll be right back. The men shifted. Aurelian saw it in his peripheral vision. Hands moving toward jacket pockets. Weight redistributing. They were about to move. But then, from the front of the restaurant came the sound of raised voices. A customer arguing with the hostess about a reservation. It wasn't real. Aurelian knew that. Marcus must have called ahead, had someone created distraction. The men hesitated, their attention split for just a second. And that second was all Aurelian needed. He walked toward the restrooms, but instead of going inside, he slipped through the service door that led to the kitchen. Mara was there, stacking plates, her face pale. She looked up, and their eyes met. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded, too scared to speak. Aurelian kept moving. Through the kitchen, past the dishwashers and line cooks who barely glanced at him, and out the back exit into an alley that smelled of garbage and old grease. He heard sirens in the distance. Marcus had come through. The police were close. Aurelian pressed himself against the brick wall and waited, his breath coming fast, his mind still trying to process the impossible. Selene had tried to have him killed. The woman who had slept beside him, who had kissed him goodnight, who had made him believe in something beyond profit margins and hostile takeovers. She had sold him out. Back inside the restaurant, chaos erupted. Police officers entered through the front, moving quickly but quietly, the way they do when lives are on the line. The men by the exits tried to blend in, but it was too late. They were surrounded, questioned, and within minutes detained. Selene remained seated at the table, her phone still in her hand, her face frozen in an expression Aurelian would never forget. Not fear, not panic. Shock. The kind of shock that comes from watching a plan fall apart in real time. She had underestimated one thing: the compassion of a stranger. Mara stood near the kitchen door, watching as officers took statements, as the restaurant emptied, as her manager tried to make sense of what had just happened. A detective approached her. "You're the one who wrote the note?" Mara nodded. "Why?" the detective asked. "Why did you get involved?" Mara thought about her father, about the silence that had eaten him alive, about the choice she had made years ago to never let fear stop her from doing what was right. "Because staying quiet doesn't protect anyone," she said. "It just makes you part of the problem." The truth surfaced over the following weeks. Slowly, methodically. Selene hadn't acted alone. She had been working with a rival investment firm, one that Aurelian had outbid on a major acquisition 6 months earlier. They had lost billions because of him, and they wanted revenge. But they also wanted access to his accounts, his passwords, his private files. Selene had been planted. Not randomly, not by chance. She had been hired to get close to him, to learn his routines, to gain his trust. And when the time was right, she was supposed to hand over everything. The plan was simple. Stage a robbery. Make it look like a random act of violence. Kill Aurelian, take his phone and laptop, and disappear. The firm would get what they needed. Selene would get paid, and no one would ever know. Except Mara had noticed, and Mara had spoken. And that one act of courage had unraveled everything. Aurelian stepped back from public life after that, not out of fear, but out of necessity. He realized that he had spent decades building an empire, but he had never stopped to ask what it was all for. He had money, power, influence, but he had been so focused on protecting what he had that he had forgotten to protect himself. He started quietly funding scholarships for kids who grew up like he did, in neighborhoods where opportunity was a luxury. He donated to organizations that supported whistleblowers, people who spoke up when it would have been easier to stay silent. He never made a public announcement about any of it. He didn't need the recognition. He just needed to know that he was doing something that mattered. Mara went back to her shifts at Lumiere. The restaurant tried to give her a raise, tried to make her a hero, but she refused. She didn't want attention. She just wanted to keep living her life. But something inside her had changed. She no longer wondered what kind of person she would be when tested. She knew, and that knowledge gave her a quiet confidence she had never had before. Years later, on a cold Tuesday in November, Mara was working the lunch shift when a man walked in alone. He was older now, his hair more gray than brown, but she recognized him immediately. Aurelian Cross. He didn't have a reservation, but the hostess seated him anyway. People like him didn't need reservations. Mara approached his table, her notepad ready. "Can I get you something to drink?" He looked up at her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he smiled. Not the polished smile he gave to investors and journalists. A real one. "Just water, thank you." She nodded and turned to leave, but he stopped her. "Mara." She froze. He remembered her name. I never got to properly thank you, he said quietly. For what you did. Mara shook her head. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do, he said. You saved my life, and you didn't have to. She looked at him, this man who had everything, who had almost lost it all, and realized that they weren't so different. Both of them had been shaped by the choices of others, and both of them had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change everything. What would you have done? Mara asked suddenly. If you were me, if you saw something wrong, would you have said something? Aurelian thought about it, really thought about it. I don't know, he admitted. I'd like to think I would, but courage isn't something you know you have until the moment comes. Mara smiled. Then I guess we both got lucky. They talked for a few more minutes. Not about money or power or what had happened to Celine, just about life, about second chances, about the invisible people who sometimes save us without ever asking for anything in return. When Aurelian left, he placed a folded piece of paper on the table. Mara picked it up. Inside was a check, more money than she had ever seen, and a note that read, "For choosing to speak. Thank you for reminding me what matters." So now we ask you, what would you have done in Mara's place? Do you believe courage is instinct or a decision we make in the moment? Have you ever had to choose between staying silent and speaking up? How did it feel? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read them all. And if stories like this move you, stories about quiet bravery, human truth, and moments that change everything, click that subscribe button for more narratives that stay with you long after the screen fades. Because sometimes, the bravest heroes leave behind nothing but a note and a future saved.